Good morning, friends. Welcome to the Immanuel 10 at 10. As many of you may have heard, Hannah Chernogle, the youngest daughter of our missionaries to Spain, Tim and Paula Chernogle, was killed in a tragic car accident earlier this week. Her funeral will be on Monday in Orange City. There's also a YouTube link, so anyone who wishes can view the service online. You can find out more information on our website and email. Um, Please keep Tim and Paula and their whole family in your prayers. In 2021, we are reading through the Bible together as a congregation using the One Year Chronological Bible reading plan. This week we started through the book of Leviticus, which a lot of people tend to avoid when they read the Bible. That's totally understandable because Leviticus seems very strange to us. The whole book is filled with instructions for the Levites, the tribe of Israel that was in charge of the tabernacle and later the temple. Today we read all these instructions for animal sacrifice and purity laws and descriptions of the duties of the priests, which sound a lot more like instructions for butchers than pastors, and we walk away scratching our heads. But there's some very interesting and important things in Leviticus if we look at how the book is organized as a whole. Our friends at the Bible Project have a great video study that walks through their summary poster for the book. I'm including a link to it in the description of this live stream. One of the things that they point out is that Leviticus neatly bridges the gap between the end of Exodus and the beginning of the book of Numbers. At the end of Exodus, Moses had the Israelites construct a portable tent of meeting where God's presence came to dwell with them. But when God's glory filled the tent, Moses couldn't go inside. Leviticus answers the question of how an unholy, sinful people can approach God's holy presence. God is described throughout the Bible as holy, which means set apart and unique. He is the creator and the author of life, the source of all goodness, purity, and justice. Israel, and all of us, on the other hand, are unjust and sinful. So, how can we be reconciled to God so that we can live in his presence? There are three main things that the book of Leviticus talks about to help bridge the gap between humanity and God: rituals, priests, and purity laws. Chapters 1 through 7 are all about ritual sacrifices. Now, for us, animal sacrifice sounds terrible. Why would we, want to learn about how they did that all those years ago? But in that day, sacrifice was the primary way that people of any culture would try to appease the gods. And so by giving these rituals, these ways of offering sacrifice, uh, God was demonstrating to them, giving them a way that they could know for certain that they were set right with God. They didn't have to worry about, the gods being so unpredictable and, uh, as all of the gods of the other nations were. Instead, God provided a way for them to come into his presence. The people were to bring different offerings for various reasons to the tent of meeting. Now, some of the sacrifices were a way to say thank you to God for all of his blessings. Other sacrifices were a way of saying sorry for the ways that they had messed up. The blood of the sacrifices were spattered against the altar to atone or cover their sin. The people were forbidden to eat any fat or the blood of an animal, which represented its life. Chapters 8 through 10 are about Aaron and his sons being set apart as priests to represent God to the people and the people before God. In chapter 10, there's a shocking story about Aaron's sons brazenly coming into God's presence in the tent with unauthorized fire and paying the ultimate price. That story is often repeated in the Bible as a warning about the sheer holiness of God's presence. Chapters 11 to 15 have to do with ritual purity. Leviticus makes a big deal about a big distinction between purity, which has to do with life and being clean, and impurity, which is associated with being unclean and death. People were made impure through contact with reproductive fluids, having a skin disease, touching mold or dead bones, or eating impure animals. However, ritual impurity was not sinful, it was something that was normal and temporary. When someone became accidentally impure by touching things that were associated with mortality and loss of life, they could offer an appropriate sacrifice and be clean again in 2 weeks. All of these purity laws distinguished Israel from the surrounding cultures and reminded them that God's holiness affects every part of life. In next week's readings, we'll see how each of these three ways of coming into God's presence, the ritual sacrifices, the ordination of the priests, and the ritual purity laws, are all echoed by other chapters that have to do with the ritual feasts, these 7 different um, festivals that they were to celebrate every year to remind them of God's provision for them. Other chapters about the qualifications for the priests and moral purity laws for the people. Israel and their leaders were called to live differently than the other people around them. In between these two halves of the book are 2 chapters, Numbers 16 and 17, which describe the Day of Atonement. That was a day each year on which the priest would make a purification offering to atone for the sins of Israel that they did unknowingly. One goat would be slaughtered, and another goat served as a scapegoat. The priest would lay his hand on that second goat to place the sins of the people on it, and then released it into the wilderness, demonstrating that God had taken their sins far away. At the beginning of Leviticus, God spoke to Moses from the tent of meeting because Moses could not go in. At the beginning of the book of Numbers, God spoke to Moses in the tent. Moses was allowed into God's presence because God opened a way for the people to be made holy. In the New Testament, the book of Hebrews talks about how Jesus surpasses Moses, the priests, and all the sacrifices by giving the ultimate sacrifice himself, his own death on the cross. Jesus has opened up a way into God's presence through the curtain of his own body. His death and resurrection makes us a holy people who are called to live differently than the world around us. This Sunday in our adult class, we're going to look at a more recent video from the Bible Project that extends our conversation about Leviticus. I invite you to join us in person or follow along with the link in our weekly email so that you can do the study right at home. Hope to see you this Sunday for worship, Sunday school, and adult education, and Wednesday night for our Lenten service at 6:30. Have a great weekend.